Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to see all of you here this morning. Um, I'll share some brief thoughts here on happiness. Um, when we think about emotional, psychological, when we think about health in general, happiness or our subjective sense of how happy we are is and should be an important indicator of where we stand on a number of things. And so we'll reflect briefly on some concepts, some ideas that have been found to be helpful. Much of the research that I draw on for this presentation, this brief presentation, is from a Harvard study and presentations by some professors there. It may be thought-provoking. I hope that it is. It gets us reflecting in ways that move us forward. So, happiness. It is a sad reality, sad fact that even though we're at a moment of great economic success, material wealth, that the trends when it comes to the reported happiness of people in North America in general, in the US in particular, North America in general, have been trending downwards since these things started being tracked in the 50s and 60s. And so even though we have so many more in terms of so many more amenities, so much more disposable income, so many more things to play with, toys, cell phones, Wi-Fi, televisions, even though we have so many things that make life easier in the home, things that help us to cook quicker, to clean faster, things that, our homes are heated, all of these things, all of the accumulated benefits of civilization to this point are found to not be having an impact in terms of raising or increasing our happiness, our sense of subjective happiness. 1 in 10 adults in the US reports being clinically depressed. Those numbers are comparable here in Canada. Antidepressant use has increased 40% since 1994. Researchers at Harvard and other places have identified 3 elements that are associated with happiness. And so there are 2 ways in which we can think about happiness. They are, or at least the things that are impacting our ability to be happy. There are those large cultural realities that we can talk about, but won't have time for today. And then there are those that are on the individual level, on the level of the family and the individual. Those are the elements that we'll talk about here this morning. There are 3 elements there. The first one that has been found to be important, significant when it comes to the experience of happiness is having access to pleasurable experiences and having the skills to amplify them. So 2 pieces there. It's having access to pleasurable experiences, say a good, healthy, tasty meal, and also having the ability to amplify it. Say having the ability to savor your food instead of just taking mouthfuls and working through your plate quickly. Savoring or mindfulness are skills, examples of skills that can help you amplify your sense of pleasure in a given moment. The risks with pleasure are these, that they tell us that 50% of the capacity to experience pleasure is heritable. It's genetic. What that means is that some people are just more sensitive, more susceptible to pleasure than others. It takes less to make them super happy than it does somebody else, right? That's something that's outside of our control. The second risk is that we are habituated to pleasure, which means that if we enjoy a pleasurable experience when we have a nice vanilla cone of ice cream, for instance. The first time we taste it, our pleasure is heightened in a way that it is not the second time and the third time and the fourth time and so forth. We habituate to pleasure. But the ability to access pleasure is one of the three elements that has been found to be important for happiness. The second is the ability to experience flow. That is, those experiences when time stops for you, that you're so engrossed in what you're doing that time stops. Athletes will say, I was in the zone, right? In fact, I've read basketball players who talk about when they're in that zone, when they're in the flow, that the basket feels like a swimming pool. They can't miss, is how one author, one player described it. Experiencing flow, having those experiences where it feels like time stops for us. We're so engrossed in the activity. That is the second element necessary for happiness. Here's the difference between pleasure and flow, is that when it comes to pleasure, pleasure is about feeling, while flow is about not feeling. Some words, some adjectives used to describe flow: to be absorbed, engrossed, lost in whatever activity we're doing. And so they're very different. They're contrasting experiences. Pleasure is about feeling. Flow is about not feeling. Those are two of the three elements they've found to be important for happiness. Here's a third: the pursuit of meaning. It consists of knowing your signature strengths and using them in the service of something bigger than yourself. Knowing your signature strengths and using them in the pursuit of something bigger than yourself. Say, for instance, if one of your signature strengths is singing, knowing that is a strength and using it, then deploying it for something bigger than yourself. And so using the gift of singing in a worship service is sort of categorized under pursuit of meaning. It's the most meaningful experience that we can put a gift to work towards. And so those are the three elements: the experience, having access to pleasure, the experience of flow, and the pursuit of meaning, as defined this way. Those are the three ingredients essential for life, for happiness and life satisfaction. Here's what they found to further explain. They found that for life satisfaction, the pursuit of happiness, the pursuit of pleasure has no positive impact. The pursuit of pleasure has no positive impact. If you were to draw it on a graph, the pursuit of happiness, of pleasure, if you're enjoying a pleasurable activity, it would go up, and then once the activity is done, it would go down, right? You'd go back to baseline soon after the activity is done. This is what pleasure is like, and that's part of the reason why when people are pursuing pleasurable experiences, they have to repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat, because they're trying to catch that moment that elevates them, right? But the problem with pleasure is it goes up and then it goes down. Our sense of satisfaction goes up and then it goes down. We go back to baseline pretty quickly. The pursuit of meaning has the biggest impact when it comes to life satisfaction. And so what that means is when we do something that's meaningful, when we use our gifts in service of something bigger than ourselves, the graph is different. It goes up and it stays up generally. It gradually decreases, but it stays up longer. It lasts longer. That sense of gratification, satisfaction, joy, happiness lasts longer. When we use our gifts in service of something bigger than ourselves, the impact, the shall I say, afterglow is lasting. And then the third here, the pursuit of flow has been found to be to have the second biggest impact when it comes to life satisfaction. And so its decline is not quite as precipitous as that of pleasure, but it is not quite as lasting as meaning either. right? Um, and so those three things there, you want to keep those in mind. And here's what they found is the highest impact is experienced when we find our flow in the pursuit of something bigger than ourselves. And so you're combining two elements required for happiness. There is you're finding your flow, doing something, pursuing something that is bigger than yourself, serving something that is bigger than yourself. And so if I find my flow, if I'm a singer and I present a piece and I get lost and engrossed in that piece while drawing other people into a worship experience, a meaningful worship experience, that has the highest impact when it comes to life satisfaction, when it comes to happiness. And so the take-home point here is that it's important to know your 5 highest strengths and then to craft your life in a way that allows you to use them as much as possible. What are your 5 highest strengths? And how can you design your life so that you get to use those 5 strengths as much as possible? Because the more you have flow, moments of flow where you get engrossed, the higher your life satisfaction is going to be. The more you use your gifts in the pursuit of something bigger than yourself, in the service of something bigger than yourself, the higher your life, your happiness is going to be. If you can combine those two things, as sometimes happens for singers, for preachers, for teachers, for whatever we do, we get lost in the moment while serving others. That has the highest impact when it comes to satisfaction and happiness. Final point to consider. Here's a happiness pie chart. And they tell us that 50% of our happiness is genetic. It's a heritable. It's biological. There's a genetic set point that accounts for 50% of how happy we feel. And what that means is some people are it's just easy to make them happy. You buy them an ice cream and they're like, my goodness, they're so excited, you know? And so grateful talking about it 2 years later. It's just some other people, you buy them something much more expensive and it's like by the following week, it's forgotten, right? Some people are just more sensitive, more susceptible to feeling happy than others. And so you may not be at in the sort of 50 sort of, you may not be high when it comes to this particular element, but maybe you're at a 20%, 25%, maybe 30, 35%. It's not hard to make you happy. Take that number and then let's compare it now to the rest of the pie chart. 10% of happiness, they say, depends on life circumstances. Your job, whether your relationships, your marriage, how things are going with your kids, etc. Just 10%. 40% of happiness, they say, depends on intentional activities, perspective, beliefs, views we nurture, develop, and strengthen. And so here's the point that is important for us to keep in mind is we often think of our happiness as being determined by life circumstances when it in fact is not the case. Here's a good example, a quick example. They've measured after people's sense of happiness before they got married and after they got married, before they were in a relationship, after they were in a relationship, and when people get married, they do find that the happiness, that sense of happiness, does go up for a year or two, and then it goes back to right. And the important thing to keep in mind there is marriage isn't going to make you happy if you're not already happy. It can momentarily make you happy, but you're going to go back to baseline. So if you're an unhappy person, generally, you're going to go back to baseline, whether you're married or not, whether you have that great job or not, whether you have that degree or not. We go back to baseline. Happiness is, circumstances account for only 10% of our happiness. Here's where the rich pickings are when it comes to happiness is it's our views, our intentional activities, our beliefs, our perspectives, our faith. And that's 40% of what determines happiness, what makes for happiness. So say, for instance, you have 25% out of 40 here, you're doing those things, you're nurturing your faith, you're serving others, you're doing all of these things that make for happiness. And maybe let's say you have a 25% set point when it comes to genetically, you're at 50%. Let's say your circumstances allow you to be 6% sort of happy. You're over half. You're at 60, 70%. You're doing good. You're doing good. And so these things here, our genetic set point and our circumstances, we may not have a lot of control over. We do have control over our intentional activities, and that's where the difference is made. Whether we are generally happy people or not, and we have control over that. And so to wrap up, my hope is that Christians ought to have this market corner, because Christianity is all about serving something bigger than ourselves. And if we can do that and apply our gifts to serve God in a way that we get lost and engrossed in, we're gonna be happy people. And we know that God wishes happiness for his children. Thank you so much for listening in on this brief presentation. May God bless us as we seek to find that place of happiness and as we seek to serve him continually. God bless you.
It's beautiful.
Now we'll turn it over to Pastor for our sermon on the second coming. Did you enjoy the happiness talk this morning?
Yes.
Yes, things that I never knew really about how to think about happiness going forward. I felt like that could have been a sermon in itself there, right? The happiness. So over to Pastor.
It's a pleasure to see all of you here this morning. I pray and trust that God is keeping you, sustaining you, and seeing you through this very unique situation one day at a time. The scripture says, the prayer that Jesus taught us to pray says, give us our daily bread. And so the assurance that we need comes to us, need only come to us one day at a time. God's provision need only come to us one day at a time. And so if we have his provisions today, his protection today, this is as much as we need, and we'll wake up tomorrow and ask for it tomorrow also. It would be nice to see things clear through the rest of the year and to know when this will stop. But we don't have that. God has chosen to withhold that insight from us. What's necessary, he has provided one day at a time. Our title this morning, what Jesus taught about the second coming. The reality of how fragile our situations are, how fragile our lives are, comes to us. We feel it very keenly anytime there is a disturbance to the structures and the pillars that hold up our world. And so when 9/11 happened, there was a shaking of the pillars in a way that caused people to search for God, to look to God for answers. And I've spoken here about my experience, and there may be many of you who share that same experience with Y2K and the fears that came about, that were aroused by the concerns about what would happen at the turn of the century. And here it is, we find ourselves in a global situation of some degree of unprecedentedness. And we're looking for answers at this time. Some we can find in the scriptures, some God withholds. But I thought it appropriate this morning for us to reflect on what Jesus taught about the second coming. To the extent that we have the second coming on our minds, or the fear of the end of the world on our minds, what comfort, what consolation can we find in what Jesus had to say about the second coming? And so that's what our message will be about this morning. Let us bow our heads for prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you so much for your grace. Please be with us now as we come to your word, as we seek understanding in the scriptures. May your spirit be present to guide us, to lead us, to teach us, to reveal to us new insights, and to grant us understanding. Bless your name today. Watch over your children. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 All right, this need not be a monologue. And so if you have observations or questions or contributions, in fact, that you'd like to offer up, feel free to step right in to so indicate, and we'll make sure that I'll make sure that I give you space and time for that. There are 5 things that we're going to cover in our message this morning. We're going to cover 5 parables that Jesus presents, beginning in Matthew chapter 24, verse 42, and ending in Matthew chapter 25, verse 46. He presents a series of 5 parables, each of them with new insights or new ways of thinking about or looking at the second coming. And so one parable unfolds one thought, and the next parable unfolds an additional thought, and all 5 here share insights that are helpful for us to take note of. And the parables are the parable of the householder, the parable of the unfaithful servant, the parable of the 10 virgins, the parable of the talents, and the parable of the sheep and goats. Let's go to it. The first parable is found in Matthew chapter 24, verse 42 to 44. Therefore, it says, keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. Take a look at this briefest of parables. If the householder had known what time the thief would come, he would not have allowed his house to be broken into. And so imagine this. You get noticed somehow, Sister Victoria, that a thief is planning to break into your home tonight. Are you going to go to bed tonight?
Maybe not.
Probably not.
I would probably call for reinforcement.
You call Brian and Rohan
Yeah.
and others to come and watch, help you keep watch. And so you're
Right.
not sleeping a wink that night. Here's the problem. What if you're told a robber, someone's coming to break into your house this month, sometime this month? What do you do then?
Very
You go to bed?
stressful.
Very stressful.
Yeah.
In part because you can't stay awake all month, right?
No.
Or for 2 months or for 6 months. This is the predicament we find ourselves in when it comes to the second coming, is we know we ought to live with expectancy. But because it's not tonight, we find ourselves being drawn away to do other necessary things. What Christ is saying here is, and he'll touch on it later when he shares the parable of the 10 virgins, is they slept, they had to sleep, but there was a difference in terms of their preparation. And so for this first parable, the teaching is we've got to live with expectancy, that we've got to live with our little baggie packed all the time. As and I had so many years ago when we were expecting Matthew. A little baggie packed away just in case, right? And it's a metaphorical bag then for the Christian is, do we have our bag packed away? Or is everything put away and we're not expecting to be aroused out of our sleep with a cataclysmic event that makes a difference between where we stand whether we were saved or not. Do we live with expectancy? Is my attitude, is your attitude in living my life different from those who are not expecting or anticipating the soon return of Jesus Christ? Christ says in this first parable, we've got to live with expectancy. And take a look what he says in verse 44. He says, the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. There will be an element of surprise, even for those who are living with expectancy. In the same way that if you're expecting a child, even though you're expecting a child, the minute that the water breaks is always a little bit of a surprise, right? Nobody looks at that and says, well, I was expecting that, and calmly goes about their business. The water breaking in a pregnancy announces that the child's arrival is imminent, and it always takes parents, expectant parents, by surprise. As long as they're prepared, they can organize themselves to do what needs to be done. And so this is the quandary we find ourselves in. We're expecting Jesus to return soon, but we've been given a month in which to expect him, and we inevitably get drawn away to other activities, other necessities of life. The most important thing for us to remember from this first parable is we've got to live with expectancy. The reality of his coming has to shape and influence the way we live. This is the lesson of the first parable, the parable of the householder. Any observations, questions, or contributions? We'll allow a brief moment for that.
So in other words, we have to do all we can, follow the preparation order, and leave the rest to the master.
Amen. Indeed. Yes. Yes. I think that's a beautiful way to put it. That God never does for us what we can or should do for ourselves. You know, a preacher long ago said to me, or to a congregation in a sermon, said, when you take a look at the experience of Christ resurrecting Lazarus, it illustrates just how God works with us. And so when Christ finds out Lazarus is dead, he asks them, take me to where he is, right? God could have found out, but he had human agencies who knew where Lazarus was. And so he allows those human agencies to lead him to the grave of Lazarus. When he gets to the grave, he says, remove the stone. He could have removed it by his power, by a word, by a flick of his finger. But he allows the human agencies around him, the people around him, to play their part. He asked them to move it. And then that thing that the disciples couldn't do, which is resurrect Lazarus, Christ does that. And so when it comes to our preparation for the second coming, God will not do for us what we ought to or what we can do for ourselves. This is one of the dilemmas, the issue that comes up in the story of the 10 virgins, is they haven't prepared, and the bridegroom can't prepare for them. And so, yes, Sister Victoria, we must prepare and do those things to prepare ourselves that we can. Any other observations? All right. Here's the second parable then. The parable of the unfaithful servant. It's found in Matthew chapter 24. I'll read from verse 45 on. Who then is the faithful and wise servant, whom the master has put in charge of the servants in his household to give them their food at their proper time? It will be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so when he returns. Truly, I tell you, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. Verse 48. But suppose that servant is wicked and says to himself, my master is staying away a long time, and he then begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and to drink with drunkards. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, at an hour he is not aware of. He will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. The second parable is the parable of the unfaithful servant. The unfaithful servant is left in charge of the master's household while the master takes a trip, goes on a trip. He doesn't announce how long he will be. He says, I'll be back. And so they know he'll be returning. The servant serves faithfully for a month, for 2 months, for 3 months perhaps. He finds his master is not returning. And listen to how Jesus puts it. He says, suppose that servant is wicked and says to himself, my master is staying away a long time. This is the first reference in this series of 5 parables where Jesus alludes to, references the master staying away a long time, references a delay.
Mm-hmm.
Says, if the servant says, my master is staying away a long time, and he begins to beat his fellow servants, to drink and eat with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him.
Yeah.
Here's the point that Christ is making. That Christ has expectations of how we're to conduct ourselves. But before I get to that point, the point to consider here that the master's return gets delayed for reasons of which the servants know nothing. Reasons for which, if they had insight into, they might understand why the delay. And so we find ourselves in these servants' shoes, recognizing there's a delay in the coming, not knowing why, what the reasons are for that delay. The lesson of the parable of the unfaithful servant is this. The parable stresses that Christians have duties and ethical responsibilities as they wait.
Mm-hmm.
More to the point, that God cares how we treat our fellow servants while we wait. That some of what this unfaithful servant is measured by in terms of his unfaithfulness isn't tithing or Sabbath keeping. He may indeed have been doing that and then going over and beating his fellow servants, mistreating his fellow servants. And for those reasons and others, the Bible, Christ describes him as unfaithful. That our attitude, our posture, our behavior towards others matters to God in the period of time while we're waiting for the second coming.
Sometimes also, sometimes it also reveals our character. When there's a delay, the first parable tells us that we must keep ourselves occupied and doing things, right? And then this is unfaithful servant, is that sometimes we can become weary of doing things, and then it leads on to revealing our true character. So it becomes a testing time of whether we are loyal to Christ or not.
Great point. These days, we've been doing a lot of, many of us have been doing a lot of waiting in line, hopefully patiently. If you've been at Costco here recently, you know that the lines can be winding this way and that, and then the other way and back. And that's fine as long as Costco opens at 9 o'clock. If you're in a long line and they delay their opening, we might see some things here. We might see some things in terms of how people are feeling under the stress of the current situation. So let's say Costco didn't open at 9 or at 8, as the case might be, and they open at 10:30, and you've been waiting in line since 7 o'clock. To Jenny's point, behavior might start presenting itself that tells us not just how you're feeling in the moment, but it tells us a little bit about yourself, about who you are, character-wise. Delays can bring out the worst in us. And maybe more to the point, they don't necessarily bring out the worst in us, they reveal to us who we really are. And so what happens here with this unfaithful servant is his unfaithfulness is camouflaged and masked, suppressed, while everything is going as it should. When something goes not according to plan, his real self shows up, and he's abusive and hurtful and belligerent with his fellow servants. And that is why his behavior is germane, is relevant to the judgment. It's because it shows whether he has inculcated the principles of the law in his heart, in his character, or not. And so the reason why he's excluded, or the reason why he's condemned, is because his character shows he has not absorbed or inculcated the principles of the law into his character and therefore into his being. Any other observations? Thanks for that, Jenny. A great insight. And this is the parable then of the unfaithful servant. The lesson we learn from the parable of the unfaithful servant is that there are expectations for how we are to conduct ourselves in the waiting time. God is watching.
I think also it depends what. Hello?
Yeah,
Please
we
go
can
ahead.
hear you.
Yeah, we're hearing you.
Huh?
We can hear you, Sister Novia. Please go ahead. Okay.
I support.
Some technical issues there. Perhaps we'll proceed with the next passage here. The next parable.
Okay, sorry. Oh, okay. I'm saying also it depends as Christians what we call a delay. Because I have to wait as if Christ is coming tomorrow.
Keep going.
Please go ahead, Sister Novia. I think part of the issue is I think you may be listening to the live stream at the same time, and so it's feeding back into this service.
What we call a delay.
Okay, we'll proceed. We'll catch your question at a later point there, Sister Novio. Matthew 25, verses 1 to 10. The 10 virgins. The parable of the 10 virgins. I'll read from verse 1 to verse 10. At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were wise. The foolish ones took their lamps, but did not take any oil with them. The wise ones, however, took oil in jars along with their lamps. The bridegroom was a long time in coming. This is the second time we hear about a delay. It was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy and fell asleep. Here's the question. An obvious question, perhaps, but a relevant question nonetheless. How many of the virgins fell asleep?
Oh,
We're sleeping.
All of them fell asleep. How many of them had lamps?
all had lamps.
All of them had lamps. And so this parable speaks not to a difference between Christians and non-Christians. This parable is speaking to Christians. They're all virgins, pure. They're all carrying lamps. We might say representing the scriptures, the word. What's missing here is the preparation. And so you've got a group of Christians, half of whom are prepared and the other half are not. The parable of the 10 virgins highlights this lesson, that the difference between the wise and the foolish believers is not whether they sleep, they all do, but that not all have prepared for the summons. Some have left their preparation to the last minute when it is too late. Something that I like about this story here is when you go on to read from verse 7, it says, Then all the virgins woke up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish ones said to the wise, give us some of your oil, our lamps are going out. Verse 9 says, no, they replied. There may not be enough for both us and you. Instead, go over to the store, to the shop, to get some additional oil for yourself. I like how boundaried the 5 wise virgins are. They set a clear boundary. They recognize that saying no is not opposed, is not in contravention to the spirit of Christ. That it is good and healthy and proper to have boundaries, to be able to say, no, I can't do that, or I can't share that, or I can't participate in that. This idea that if we're Christians, we're boundaryless and people can just step all over us and around us it's not a biblical idea. Christ teaches here that the 5 wise virgins are able to set clear boundaries. No, I'm not sharing with you. Let me tell you where you can get it, however, and I hope you get there before the store closes. Right? So yes, the Christians here, all of them fall asleep, but some are prepared while others are not. This is the point of the story. Any observations or questions on this story? Okay. And so the lesson of the first parable is expectancy. The lesson of the second parable is ethical responsibilities and obligations. The lesson of the third parable is preparation. That you cannot force preparation. You cannot do preparation when your time is up. That the preparation is to be done during the preparation time. And if we don't prepare in time, we will not make it into the banqueting. Those are the first three parables. Here's the next, the parable of the talents. Matthew 25. I'll read from verse 14 on. Again, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. The man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 bags more. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. But the one who had received 1 bag went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, there it is again. The third time in 4 parables that Christ refers to a long time or a delay. He knew what he was talking about. He knew that there would in fact be this long stretch of time when people felt like, I wish Christ would come already. He said he was going to come. And so he tells us 3 times in a short passage of scripture, 3 times there was a delay. It was a long time before the master came back. And as we discussed earlier during Sabbath school, when God repeats himself that way, it means, it suggests that he's doing that for emphasis, but also because he's fully intent on doing that which he's communicating in that particular passage. And so verse 19, after a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. And here comes the difference then, is the man who received 5 talents has made 5 more. The one who received 2 has made 2 more. The one who received 1 digs up his talent of gold and brings it back to the master. Some lessons to learn there. Let's first take a look at what it says here in verse 15. It says, to one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, to another 1 bag, each according to what?
His ability.
His ability. That means God recognizes that among his children, we all have different abilities. And he apportions responsibility in accordance with our ability. That there is no point in wishing to have somebody else's gifts while overlooking or neglecting my own. That my responsibility is to cultivate and to nurture the gifts that God has given me. But it's just interesting that God says, hey, I recognize your varying abilities. What he's asking for is faithfulness with respect to our abilities. He's not comparing us with somebody else. That is an important point, I believe, to note. But take a look at this. The man who has five more, brings five more. The man who has two more. The man who has one brings back his one bag of gold. What was wrong with that? Because take a look at it, right? Is digging a hole, burying a treasure in the ground at that point in history was not so unusual. It was, in fact, as long as you remembered where you dug the hole, it was considered a pretty safe way to safeguard your property. Why does this man come in for? Why is he chastised? Why is he rebuked? Any thoughts?
What came into my mind was the fact that he didn't have a relationship with God. For him to have this preconceived idea to say that, I didn't do anything with it because, I think when you come back, you would chastise me or do something. He didn't have a relationship with God for him to be able to do that.
That's a good point. It says here in verse 24, it says, I knew that you're a hard man. He describes his master as a hard man. Harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered. This was his opinion of his master.
Yeah.
You profit where you have not worked. But friend, my capital is working for me, right? I'm investing my capital is working for me. Why is it wrong for me to expect a profit where I've invested capital? He doesn't see it that way. And so what's wrong, first and foremost, in this picture is the man's relationship with his master, the man's perspective of his master. That's what's wrong. Any other observations? Great point, Jenny. Thank you. Any other observations?
Maybe he didn't have any confidence in his own ability to be able to do something with what he'd been given. Like a lot of us, we don't really have confidence in our abilities, in our talents. And so he knew his master was a hard man. So to make sure that he doesn't do anything wrong with that, he could have used the money, he could have lost it. And his master, he felt, would have been really, really mad about that. So because of his own lack of confidence, he said, let me keep my master's money safe. And that's why he put it away. So sometimes we need to have confidence in order to be able to go out, even if it's our only talent. If God has given us one, we have to do something with it.
That's such a good point, and very well made. And yes, that is exactly the issue. Is we can talk about it in terms of that he was afraid of failing. He wasn't confident in his abilities and his talents. Or we can take a look at it and describe it in terms of he was risk averse, right? And so he wanted to hold on to what he had because he was afraid of squandering or losing that money and then coming in for rebuke after. He's a hard man. If I lose any of his money, he's not going to spare me, right? So much better to play it safe. And so the application then to our times is precisely as Cynthia has shared here, is we too often play it safe with the gifts that God has given us, because we're afraid of falling flat on our faces, so to speak. The reality is God would rather that we invest and lose than that we keep the investment safe, the gift safe, because he knows if we're investing, it will pay dividends. And so this fear, this risk aversion is really a lack of confidence in the principles God has put in place.
I think the other thing, sorry, I think the other thing about that is that sometimes we allow others to dampen our confidence in our abilities. you know, and he allowed his master's roughness to dampen his ability. So we shouldn't allow people to dampen our ability for whatever reason, the way we've grown, whether our parents have told us we were useless or whatever. We shouldn't allow anyone else to dampen our confidence. We should always try to put that to God and just allow him to let us step forward and to allow us to shine, really, to grow.
Very well put. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
You know,
imagine being, I don't know if you've been at a farm where, you know, during sowing season, how these farmers will take buckets of good grain and throw it away. Well, unless it's treated, hopefully, hopefully it's treated. But if we don't treat it, if it's back in the day where people were using untreated grain, you're throwing away grain that you could very well eat that day. You know, to throw away good grain requires that you have confidence in the systems that God has put in place to regenerate. And so what this servant lacks is confidence that if he puts his investment to work, God will cause a return to come. And so he feels like, no, my goodness, I can't throw it away. That would be wasteful. I'm going to come in for a tongue lashing. And he shows thereby his lack of confidence in God and in the master service. We must have confidence that whatever our gifts, if we sow them, if we put them out there, that we're not going to fall on our faces, that God will cause our gifts to bear fruit. This is what this parable teaches us. Sister Victoria, were you going to say something?
It's okay.
Okay.
It's okay.
The other thing is that you know, as you just said a few sentences ago, that talents is a gift, and it's a gift from God, and so our talents is not of our own. So whatever we do, we don't do it of our own strength, but that we do it through God helping us through to be able to achieve what is expected of us with our talents.
Excellent. Thank you so much. The parable of the talents answers the question, what is readiness? And so Jesus talks about readiness, about being prepared in the parable of the 10 virgins. He doesn't tell us what that means. He alludes to oil, which we interpret as the Holy Spirit, but what does that mean exactly? The parable of the talents explains what that means, and readiness, according to the parable of the talents, readiness is responsible activity that produces results for the kingdom of heaven now. Responsible activity that produces results for the kingdom of heaven now. And so while we wait, we need to be about our master's business, our Father's business, as Christ put it. This is an imperative. And if we're seeking more of God's Spirit, we cannot receive more of God's Spirit while we're sitting idle. The Holy Spirit is given to those who need his empowerment to do, to serve, to minister, to reach out. And so those who are working wind up by default having a second reserve of the Holy Spirit, if we're to go back to the parable of the 10 virgins. All right. That's the fourth parable. The fifth and final parable is the parable of the sheep and the goats. And that is found in the book of Matthew, chapter 31 to 46. I'll read here from verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, And he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? The king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. The parable of the sheep and the goats. And so it's really the parable is set, it illustrates the judgment at the end of time when God separates the good from the bad, the righteous from the wicked, the sheep from the goats. And he says to the sheep, enter into my kingdom because you did all these wonderful things for me. Mm. And they say, when did we do that? And he explains. And the parable repeats the same dialogue with the goats. He says, you're not going to be in my kingdom because you didn't do these things for me. He says, when did we not do that? He says, you didn't do them for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine. You didn't do them for me. The key element of the parable of the sheep and goats is that both groups are surprised. That's the thing that stands out. Maybe before we go to the lesson of the parable, let me ask this question. Why do you suppose that everyone is surprised, that these two groups are surprised about God's verdict? Why is that?
Because they were both doing things they thought were the right things at the time they did it. And neither of them realized the consequence of their actions, because both of them are naturally doing what they would do.
Yeah. Excellent.
Sort of.
Very good insight.
Because God looks at the heart and we look on the outside, so you never know whether they're sheep versus the goats.
Okay, excellent point. Excellent point. But they're surprised for different reasons, right? And I think the righteous, the sheep, are doing the right thing without awareness or consciousness of it, right? It's that situation where, your right hand doesn't know what your left hand is doing, so to speak. They're not doing it for attention or for to be noticed or acknowledged. They're doing it just as an unconscious thing. Whereas the goats are going about doing their ministry, but expecting acknowledgement and recognition for it. And so both parties are surprised in part for that reason, but also because we can see what's in the heart. And those whose hearts have been cleansed by God's Spirit are the least aware of it. As Paul says, God came to save sinners like me, of which I am chief, right? Like you and I, of which I am chief. Paul calls himself chief of sinners because if we've really experienced the cleansing power of God's Spirit in our lives, we are the least aware of that fact most of the time. Any additional thoughts here?
Like for me, like the sheep, are doing things by righteousness, by faith. They're doing it because they are trying to, follow the will of God, because they love God, right? Whereas the goats were like, righteousness by works. They would
Right.
doing things as if to earn themselves
Yeah.
into heaven, rather than knowing that the gift of grace is free.
Yeah. Excellent point. And so, yes, I thought I was doing pretty well, right? I thought I was way ahead on the scoreboard, you know? And so they're surprised when God says, no, you're not entering into the kingdom. Anyone else?
I think too, we separate the things that we do for God from the things that we do for other people, right?
Okay.
You think that I could be good to God and I don't necessarily have to care about these people, and not seeing that it's actually related.
That's such a good
But-
point. Thank you so much, Ian.
But they're connected, because what we do for people, we do for God.
Yeah. Well, what we do to people, we do to
We
God.
do for, yeah,
It's true.
right.
Excellent points. Here's the lesson of the fifth parable. This is a statement from George Knight in his book, The Apocalyptic Vision. He says, if people have been saved, their lives will produce evidence that they have internalized the grace and love of God by their willingness to pass it on, to pass his gifts on to others. The gifts of mercy. I've received the gift of mercy, but I'm not willing to pass it on. I have not really internalized it. The gift of forgiveness. I want God to forgive me. I believe He's forgiven me, but I just won't forgive somebody else. Harkens back to the parable of the servant who gets forgiven, who he has his debt, humongous debt forgiven, but he won't forgive the few dollars that he owed him. What George Knight is saying here is part of the reason why these things come out the way they do is because they show whether we've internalized the love and the grace of God or not. And if I've internalized the love and the grace of God, it will show up in the way that I treat others, the generosity, the kindness, the forgiveness, the mercy. It's not to say I may not see wrong behavior or hurtful behavior, but God has seen wrong behavior in me, and He has extended mercy to me. And so, by all means, I need to extend mercy to others also. As we already pointed out, both the sheep and the goats are surprised by the king's verdict. An important text to consider here as we work to a close is Micah chapter 6, verses 6 to 8. He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To walk justly, to love mercy, and to walk with your God, to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Why are Christians saved by faith judged on their acts? Why are people, let me say, saved by faith condemned by their actions, on their actions? It's because when faith and grace are internalized, they shape and they influence our behavior. And so when it comes to the judgment, God could go for the unseen contents of the heart, but because that would be unconvincing to those who can't see the heart, what's in the heart, He goes for the obvious evidence of their behavior. And He says, take a look at this. I'm going to judge you by your actions because your actions tell me what was in your heart. And so we're saved by faith. We're judged on action because actions tell us whether faith has taken hold in our hearts or not. 5 parables on what Jesus believed was important to highlight about the second coming. And most of it relates to the way we are to live. And so the first parable talks about expectancy. The second parable talks about duty, ethical behavior. The third parable talks about preparedness. The fourth parable talks about productivity, profitability, trust in the God who gave us these talents. And then the final parable talks about, brings it all together and says, ultimately, what matters to God is how we're conducting ourselves toward his children. When we take care of them, when we nurture them, when we feed them, etc., we're taking care of him and nurturing him and feeding him. When we don't, we're neglecting him. And so he judges us on that basis. What does it mean? What does it mean for us in these times? It means that we need to keep our heads down, put our nose to the grindstone, so to speak, and focus. Let us do our work of preparation. That is the best way to prepare for the second coming when it comes. Let's have our little baggie packed. At the end of the day, the coming is still going to take us by surprise, but we can recover. Like the 5 wise virgins who are surprised when the bridegroom shows up, but they are prepared. We also need to be and should be prepared. I'll hold the floor open for just any final thoughts or observations before we close here this morning, this afternoon.
The way you've done this about the 5 parables, it's like a build on. It gets deeper and deeper and deeper with the information of what is expected from us as children when we're waiting for God.
That is so true. That is so true. Jesus must have been a masterful storyteller. What a blessing it would be to sit at his feet and listen to him teach. The disciples had that privilege, and others of his followers had that privilege. We will have that privilege in heaven. For 1,000 years, we'll be growing and learning essentially here at the master's feet. And yes, the way he's able to weave these stories in and develop themes in these various stories is just, it is profound. It's something to reflect on. Any other observations or comments? To conclude then, I would say this. Let us not be afraid of the second coming. Let us not look to events with trepidation or with anxiety or fear. Let us look to the coming of our Master with anticipation while we prepare. And the servant who is expecting his master and preparing need not be afraid. It doesn't matter when the master shows up. I'm about his business. And he can come in and check anytime he wants. He's going to find that I'm about his business. So I need not be afraid. I need not be afraid.
Yes.
So this pandemic will pass. May God keep us through it. There may be other events that happen that shake the pillars of our world as we know it. Let us not be alarmed. This is the message that Christ shares in later in Matthew chapter 25. Let us not be alarmed if we're focusing on our work, preparing as we should, and anticipating his return. We can calmly look to those events and trust that he'll see us through. Let us close with a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for your grace. Thank you for your word. Please apply these principles to our lives, that we might live in ways that honor you and that reflect the times in which we live. At the end of time, with the soon return of Jesus just upon us. Keep us faithful, keep us true. Dismiss us with your blessing, we ask in Jesus' name.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Pastor, for that sermon.